Hey everyone, it's Chris. Today we want to talk about the Rhone Valley wines and how they relate to ours in anticipation of the new release of our 2018 Justine and Arnaut. And here to help me with that is Eli Travers. He's been with us for about 3 years and is our Northwest sales manager. He's also a sommelier and is really good at talking about this kind of stuff. So thanks for coming to taste these with me.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And honestly, I really do love talking about these wines and really geeking out about the Rhone Valley and the origin and some of the inspiration behind these wines. So excited to taste them and talk about them. So let's first we're going to start off with a little history of the Rhone Valley and just a little bit about the geography.
Yeah, let's do it. It'll be fun.
Great.
Cheers.
The Rhone River flows from the glacial headwaters in the Swiss Alps through Lake Geneva and into eastern France, where it turns south, eventually emptying out into the Mediterranean Sea. The first winemaking in all of France can be traced to the Greeks, who settled Massalia, or modern-day Marseille, in 600 BC. From there, they shipped and distributed wine in large clay amphora up the Rhone River into the heart of Gaul. When the Romans arrived in 125 BC, they continued this trend and expanded viticulture up the river into the northern Rhone by the 1st century AD. Along with advances in winemaking, the Romans built terraces into the steep hillsides banking the river, making it easier to work the vineyards. Many of these are still around today. After the fall of Rome, wine trading declined during the Dark Ages, until the Catholic Church, as it had in Burgundy and elsewhere, revived viticulture and wine consumption in the 9th century. This culminated in 1309, when Pope Clement V moved his court from Rome to Avignon. This was where his successor, Pope John XXII, began construction on a new summer papal palace, known as Châteauneuf-du-Pape, and planted vineyards in the surrounding land. In the 17th century, traders began carrying the Rhone wines up the Loire River and eventually exported them to England. As the region's reputation for quality wines grew in the 18th and 19th centuries, merchants from other regions like Bordeaux would purchase Rhone Reds to blend in and strengthen their own wines. The powerful wines of the Hill of Hermitage were among the most famous in all of France at this time. Then, in 1863, the aphid known as phylloxera showed up in Lirac in the southern Rhone Valley, where it soon spread throughout France and all of Europe, decimating vineyards and the entire wine industry for years to come. Decades of grafting, replanting, and wine fraud followed, harming the quality and reputation of French wine. In response, growers from Châteauneuf-du-Pape banded together to establish a set of rules for production to guarantee quality. These guidelines became the prototype for the Appellation Contrôlée system, and in 1936, Châteauneuf-du-Pape became the first official AOC in France. Today, the wines of the Rhone Valley are widely considered some of the best in France and the world, from delightful and underrated Côte de Rhône blends to the rare and powerful Syrahs of Côte Rôtie and Hermitage.
So to think a little bit more about how the Rhone Valley is set up, we can really split it into two sections. There's the northern Rhone Valley and the southern Rhone Valley. The northern Rhone's climate is more of a continental climate, which means it has colder winters and hotter summers, whereas the southern Rhone climate is Mediterranean. It literally butts up to the Mediterranean Sea, where you have milder winters, warmer growing season, longer growing season, and one of the aspects of the weather and climate there that's really unique is the Mistral. The Mistral is basically a prevailing wind, a very strong wind force that comes down from the Massif Central, which is the main mountain range in the middle of France. And it does a lot of things, but it really blows hard on these vines. And you've been there, right, Chris? You've experienced the Mistral?
Yeah, we landed in Marseille during the Mistral, and it was pretty dicey. It was a kind of smaller plane, and us Americans were a little nervous, and the locals were kind of laughing at us. But it's serious, and it really that drying action really prevents rot from in the vineyard, so it really helps keep the grapes clean.
And that's a good point too, just because during harvest they do see some rain in the northern Rhone every once in a while. So especially when those grapes are really ripe and ready to get picked, it's nice to have a little help in some of those winds.
Absolutely, Syrah tends to have tight bunches as well, so it's really critical to keep that moisture out of there.
Yeah. Another thing that's sort of unique about the Rhone Valley is the soil type. So in the northern Rhone, most of the soil is granitic and schistous. These are some harder sort of bedrock, and then overlaying that is a sort of finer sand topsoil. But it really just adds a lot of power, I think, to the wines, and it really helps. The schistous soil really helps those vines dig pretty deep and just sort of lodge into the mountainside. Whereas in the southern Rhone, obviously this is the mouth or the basin of the Rhone River. You have a lot of alluvial soil, which is basically soil deposited by rivers and by water flowing. And one of the most unique soil types there is called galette, which you've seen before, right? These
that's
pudding stones.
Largely in Châteauneuf-du-Pape is kind of known for it, and they're associated with these stones, but still it's less than half of the area has these. So it's a really special part of the vineyard, special part of the world. But they're big. They're like this big, and whole vineyards are just covered with them.
Yeah, and one of the unique things about those stones and this soil type for the vineyards is sort of how they interact with the grapes. So a lot of the grapes there are trained in a way where they're a little lower to the ground, and these stones are sort of known for retaining heat during the hot days. It holds onto the heat into the evening, and then releases it onto the grapes to help that ripening process at night. So it's something, again, that sort of extends the ripening process, particularly with Grenache, which we'll talk about later, which takes a while to get ripe and really needs a lot of heat in order to do so. Another aspect of the Northern Rhone soil type is the fact that because of these super steep slopes, erosion is a problem. You have this fine sand on top, and so a lot of things are done in the vineyard to mitigate that by planting all the vines on posts or these poles into the mountain, which helps a little sturdy, but also these Roman terraces and basically building in these embankments into the steep slope help to prevent erosion.
Yeah, these slopes are so steep, and especially in Côte Rôtie, that you couldn't work on the vines without having kind of flat areas to get there. You certainly can't get a tractor up there. When you look up at the Côte Rôtie slopes in these terraces, they're just planting on every square foot they can get up there. It's really a beautiful sight.
It's amazing.
Now you can really think of these almost as two different areas completely. They're basically tied together because they're both on the Rhone River. They share a couple of grapes that are both grown in both places, but have completely different roles. In the northern Rhone, you have an area where it's the most northern climate that you can grow Syrah. And in fact, that's why they're so steep, so that the sun shines on the vineyard for the maximum amount of time to ripen. And the best areas are where it's, the Rhone goes mostly south. There's parts where in Côte Rôtie and Hermitage, it turns to the east, leading a more southern slope, and that's the highly sought over one.
Well, not only that, I think there's also the same phenomenon that you see in the Mosel River Valley and some of the other river wine regions in the world, where you also have sunlight reflecting off the river that almost amplifies the sunlight and warmth of ripening those grapes. And so you're right, when it turns west or east and you have these curves, basically when it goes into Côte Rôtie and then down again into Hermitage, it sort of loops around, you get perfect southern exposure and you get a lot more light penetration, basically. Yeah. Great. Well, next thing really to talk about with the Rhone Valley are the grapes and the grape varieties used there, because this is basically leading us into the wines that we make here in Washington. So the Northern Rhone, is known for Syrah. As far as red grapes, that's basically king. It's one of the only grapes grown in the Northern Rhone, other than some of the far out places and Côte de Rhone types that might be growing Gamay or some other interesting grapes. But Syrah is king. And then as far as white wines, the grapes that we're known for are Viognier and then Rhône and Marsanne.
Yeah, but not blended together. They're separate. The very small appellation of Condrieu is where almost all the Viognier is, and that's bottled as its own wine, 100% varietal. And although it is also allowed to ferment Viognier in with your Syrah in just Côte Rôtie. And then in Hermitage and in other areas of the Northern Rhone, they make a brilliant white wine with Marsanne and Roussanne.
Yeah, and that sort of brings us to the first wine we're going to try today. This is a wine that has already been released. We released this back at the end of May, and this is our 2018 Le Pearl. So this is basically our version of that Hermitage Blanc style wine. It's a blend of Roussanne and Marsanne that does see a little bit of oak usage, as well as concrete and neutral barrel. And it's just a phenomenal wine, and hopefully you've had a chance to try it. We're going to try it right now just because why not?
We had a lot of fun making this wine. The Roussanne comes from Sagemore, which is just north and east of the eastern edge of the Yakima Valley, and Weatherai, which is at the top of Red Mountain, and the Marsanne is from Boucher Vineyard, who we'll talk about later. We fermented this all in oak, about 25% new, and then after about half, we aged it for 14 months. After half that time, we put half of the wine in a concrete egg to kind of slow down the aging and really enrich in that texture. So it's just kind of,
and
we just had a lot of fun with
retain
it.
some of the acidity too, right? Because I know that sometimes Roussanne and Marsanne struggle to have brightness and to have a little higher acidity because they're known to be sort of broader, thicker wines.
Yeah.
But that's always something that's impressed me about this, and I don't know if it's because of concrete or maybe your picking decisions, but there is sort of a really beautiful acidity note to the wine.
The Roussanne does tend to keep acidity. Just it's a natural part of that variety. But yes, Marsanne, if you pick too late, it can really lose the acidity and lose that kind of vibrant fruitiness. So we definitely are paying close attention to that.
Yeah, and I'm gonna brag for him because he probably won't say it, but this wine already is getting some great attention in the state. We had a beautiful review from Sean Sullivan, who gave it 94 points, and these are some of the things he had to say about it. Basically, the 2018 Avennia Pearl is the best example of white Rhone style wine I've ever had from Washington. The 2018 vintage is nothing short of extraordinary. It's a revelation, a benchmark wine. I mean, these are kind of things that don't get said very often, I think, about a lot of wine. So it's pretty awesome that even on its second vintage, we're already dealing with sort of what can hopefully be a really classic version of these grapes in Washington. So
yeah, I think we're perfectly suited for that, and we have some great growers. There's not very many people growing these varieties, so we're fortunate that some of the two of the vineyards that we work with extensively on all of our wines do a great job growing these.
yeah, and there's still some of this available. I know it has been selling out really fast, so if you are interested, make sure to check it out on the website, avennia.com.
And these wines are traditionally very age-worthy. White Hermitage, which is the most famous kind of version of these blends, can go for 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
And so it'll be really exciting to kind of see how this ages. It should really age well in the cellar.
I dare you to wait 30 years to try this one. I don't think I can do it. It's too delicious. Cool.
I don't want to do that now.
So then we get down to the southern Rhone, where there's a lot more grape varieties that are grown. Obviously, it's different climate, so you're going to have different grapes that do better versus the northern Rhone. But really, when we talk about the main grapes, we're talking about Grenache, Syrah, and Mourvedre. Grenache, let's talk a little bit about Grenache, just because it is a pretty unique grape in that it's actually grown all over the world. For a long time, it was the #1 planted grape in the world, even though in Washington we don't really have that much of it. I think it's been surpassed by Cabernet now in the last few years, but originally coming from Spain, it's a thin-skinned grape. It takes a long time to get ripe. You do need a lot of heat units to do so. And then as far as the kind of wines, it can make really a wide variety of wines. You can make rosé out of Grenache. They actually have Grenache Gris, and you can make a white wine out of a different mutation of the grape. You can make sparkling wine, you can make dessert wine, you can make big, powerful wines, you can make lighter, more Pinot Noir style wines. I mean, it is truly versatile. But what's one of the things you like about working with Grenache?
I just always liked, and these were the wines that I really got into first when I was first learning about wine. Partially because I think you can get world-class examples of these and still afford them. Even that's less so now because they've gained in popularity. But the Grenache is always I think of it as like red fruits. It can have a lighter color, but that doesn't always mean it's lighter in body. And I think it's really distinguished in its best incarnation by these garrigues, what we call garrigues or herbs de Provence.
Yeah.
So kind of a herb note that complements the cherry fruit.
Yeah, and that garrigue is something that the southern Rhone is sort of known for. And it's basically the mix of scrubland and herbs, wild herbs and flowers and things that sort of grow all across the land. But there is something special about how that it affects the grapes and affects the vineyards, and you can actually get some of those flavors in the wine. I still don't know the science behind it and how it works, but I know it's there because we actually have similar type scrubland, garrigue, and lavender and certain things that are planted around some of our own vineyards not our own vineyards, but here in Washington. So Grenache is king, and then Syrah and Mourvèdre are also used a bunch in the Southern Rhone. Syrah is a earlier ripening grape. It's usually pretty higher acidity. It's known for black fruits, red fruits, meatiness. There's floral. There's spice. There's really a lot of things going on with Syrah. But tell a little bit about what makes Syrah in the Northern Rhone a little different than how they use Syrah in the Southern Rhone.
Yeah, exactly. They're just used completely differently. In the Northern Rhone, of course, it's 100% Syrah, and it's kind of like a Pinot Noir grape would be in Burgundy, where each individual little parcel will give you unique flavors and characteristics. So it's really interesting in that way. And so the most sought after bottles are very small productions from just these small parcels. In the Southern Rhone, it's used more as it's pretty warm down there, and it gets very ripe, and so it's maybe not as interesting on its own, but it does bring a lot of color, a lot of power, and a lot of mouthfeel to the Grenache. I think it complements it well.
Yeah,
it's a matter of the Grenache is great, but even only in the very best places, and often is just one small offering from a producer where it would be 100% Grenache.
Right.
It's almost always
blended, and it has to be pretty unique because, like you said, Grenache can be even though it's thin skinned and lighter in pigment and lighter in color, it can be pretty powerful because the grapes do get pretty sweet, which translates into higher alcohol through fermentation, and you can have a lot of weight, but a lot of times you won't get elevated tannin too. So another way to add in just some structure, some tannin, some darker color is using Syrah and using Mourvèdre. So Mourvèdre is probably one of the larger berried versions of wine grapes that we work with. I would assume they're known for being pretty big clusters, big grapes, thicker skins, so you do get some more tannin, some more structure. But they're also sort of known for flavors and aromas, right? This is where we get some really interesting herbal animal kind of.
Animal for Mourvèdre loves the sun. I mean, the most famous place for Mourvèdre is so far south. It's literally on the beach of the Mediterranean.
Yeah,
right? So but up in Châteauneuf, it's more marginally ripe, and so because they maybe can't get it as ripe as they'd like every year, it just plays a smaller role in these blends.
Yeah, great. Well, I think we should probably try some Grenache, Mourvèdre, and Syrah, shall we?
Yes, let's
do it. So now let's switch gears and focus a little bit on these grapes and all this Rhone style wines grown here in Washington, and specifically sort of our take on them. In general, though, what's some of the history of Rhone grapes in Washington? Who were some of the first producers to work with them and to plant them?
Yeah, it's actually more recent. We were planting even Walter Clore and Andrei Chelychev back in the 50s and 60s were starting to theorize that wine grapes could be grown in Washington. And then in the early 70s started planting, but they were all Bordeaux varieties. It wasn't until, I believe, 1986 that Red Willow with David Lake at Columbia, who they were working with pretty much exclusively then, finally planted the first Syrah in Washington in 1986. And then there's still not much more until you get into the early 90s with Boucher in 94. And so the Rhone has been just slow to catch on. It hasn't been until relatively recently that these grape varieties have been popularized. One of the first, what would now be called a Rhone Ranger winery to just concentrate on these varieties was McCrae, Doug McCrae, at the very end of the 80s into the 90s. And then, like DeLille made their first Syrah in 97. So that's when it started to kick off a little more.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's funny because when I think about Washington wines, I always gravitate towards Syrah and some of the Rhone varieties and think like, man, it's like we grow them so well. There's such great versions of these wines here, even though most of the market, most of the country doesn't realize that. They're still sort of, if they have Washington wine, they think Riesling, they think Cabernet, Merlot, Bordeaux blends. And Syrah and Grenache have always kind of struggled to get a footing, I think, in the normal market. But, that's part of the reason why we're here doing this and trying to talk them up a little bit more, is because I think these are amazing wines and they're just delicious. So what is it about the Washington, climate, the soil and weather, and sort of like why why does Syrah and Grenache, specifically where we source these grapes from, why do they work in Washington?
Well, I think that we just have this great, very dry climate that really can ripen these varieties that take a lot of sun. And we have the soil type, so we have that sandy soil, we have rocky soil in places, fractured basalt that Grenache really likes. And Syrah, people think sometimes Washington is just like one area with one style of wine. And the cool thing about Syrah is we can grow it in a lot of areas of Washington, and it can express itself really differently.
Yeah.
And that's what I think it makes it really interesting. And so Arnaut being kind of in that middle range of heat units in Washington, kind of expresses a different thing than one on Red Mountain would.
For sure. So then even more, I guess more personally, what is it about the Rhone and about Rhone varieties really inspires you as a winemaker? And why is it that you've chosen to focus on these particular wines and these grapes?
Well, partially because I think we can do them at a world-class level in Washington, as we just mentioned. But these were some of the wines that first got me into wine. They can really show a lot of character besides fruit, and that was what made them interesting to me. Also, at that time, these wines you could get world-class versions of Rhone wines for relatively inexpensively. So
right,
that's why I'm not.
Yeah,
that's why I'm not a Burgundy expert. And then when I visited there in 2005 and really just fell in love with the land too, and visited Avignon. So that's where we came up with the name Avennia. It's from Avignon. So clearly, I think these are wines that are just really interesting to me.
Yeah. Let's get into this next wine, which is the 2018 Justine, which is a blend of Grenache, Mourvèdre, and Syrah. And these are very specific vineyard sources that we're taking these from. So the Grenache is coming from Snipes Mountain, at a vineyard called Upland Vineyard. The Mourvèdre is from Red Mountain AVA, from a little sliver of land called the Heart of the Hill by Kiona's Heart of the Hill Vineyard. And then the Syrah is coming from Oldfield, which is sort of smack dab in the middle of Yakima Valley, close to Boucher, which Boucher also helps manage. What is it about those three vineyard sources with these grapes? Why did you say, wow, this is the perfect blend and the perfect version of these three together?
Yeah, we're really lucky in Washington. Like I said, we have different growing areas, and even though these are all grown within 25 miles of each other, they're really uniquely suited to the different varieties, I think. The Grenache is in upland, so that's right in the middle of the Yakima Valley. It's kind of, it's hot, but it's not, the valley gets warmer as you go east. And so this is a really beautiful, we only started getting this in 2013, and it was planted in 1999. So while it's not old vines in the general sense of the term, I think they're mature enough vines where they can show those extra notes. I think that this is where you get the garrigue, some fresh thyme and rosemary kind of notes in there, and but not get it too ripe.
Right.
Where it might get if it was on Red Mountain. But the Mourvèdre, as we said, likes more heat. And this Kiona does a great job growing this. And it's still late in the season. Even on the very hot Red Mountain, we're still picking this in sometimes the middle of October.
Wow, yeah, it takes a long time for Mourvèdre to get right.
Yeah, and if it doesn't get fully ripe, it's just not as interesting for sure.
Yeah.
And then the Syrah, I really like this. This is a newer French clone of Syrah that Dick Boucher grows right next to his place. And it really shows, I think it shows a lot more of those kind of.
Is there a little more color in it?
It's very dark, yeah. It's very dark, and it also, because it's in that milder climate, it's not super overripe. And I think one thing about the Justine is it's about elegance. It's not about the hugeness. Even though in 2018, it still has aspects of, there's a lot of concentration.
Yeah, I was going to say, Justine, full disclosure, is one of my favorite wines in the lineup that we make, even though I'm responsible for selling all the wines. I've always said Justine is just, it's so beautiful, it's so aromatic, there's so much going on, but then it surprises you with the amount of power and concentration it actually has. You don't really expect it to be as a powerhouse, or as much of a powerhouse as it is, I think. When you smell it, because, I mean, you're totally right. There's that garrigue, there's lavender, there's sort of a mix of fresh and dried herbs in there. A lot of bright red berry fruits. There's some blue fruits. There's definitely like a spice profile. There's so much going on, and it would lend me to think of almost, Gamay Noir, Pinot Liqueur, super aromatic, fruity wines. But then you put it on your palate, and it's just, there's such a depth of concentration and flavor there, which is really exciting.
One thing new this year I think was pretty exciting is we got a couple like cubicle concrete fermenters. So we actually fermented a good portion, most of the Grenache in that concrete.
Yeah, let's talk about concrete for a second, because I've heard it's basically, it really is a buzzword right now. There's a lot of producers that are moving towards concrete. And from what I understand, and we've talked about this before, that it really is sort of the sweet spot of a vessel between your super tight stainless steel vessel and then your breathable oak barrel. And so you have concrete tanks or concrete eggs in the middle that have basically a little more capacity to breathe and introduce oxygen into the wine, but you're also not flavoring it. You're not really affecting the fruitiness, the grapiness, and the acidity level. Can you just talk a little bit more about sort of why concrete and why for this wine?
Yeah, so when we talk about concrete, there's two different ways we use concrete with red wines. We ferment in it, and I associate that more with Rhone varieties, but we're now experimenting with Bordeaux varieties, and it's really nice. And then there's élevage, or raising the wine in concrete, which we also do a portion of this, and that's in smaller, like concrete eggs, where it spends a portion of its raising in concrete. But they both do two things. As you mentioned, it's the oxygen exchange is somewhere between stainless steel and barrel and wood. And the main thing air changes is texture. So it's really about texture and preserving those aromatics.
Yeah.
So I think that has really added to that mid-palate weight of this wine.
Well, then it also doesn't it affect temperature too, because it basically insulates your vessel more. So it, like, for as far as fermentation, it might not ferment at higher temperatures, which might make things a little quicker and a little boozier, but it actually has a little cooler, slower fermentation process. Is that
Exactly.
Is that the case?
Yes. Yeah, that's an important part of it. It takes longer to get warmer, so you can get less peak temperatures, but then once it's done and you're extracting like structure and complexity at the end, it's retaining that heat, whereas with stainless steel it dissipates immediately.
Right.
So there's just a different dynamic, and I can't say I understand everything about it, but when I put the two next to each other, there's a distinct difference.
Yeah, for sure.
I really like it in concrete.
For sure. The other thing about this wine that intrigues me, and really about how you treat Rhone varieties, is stem inclusion, and sort of the discussion about whether or not to destem the clusters, basically, processing the grapes and taking all the grapes off of each cluster and sort of fermenting on its own, or including some of the stems in the fermenter, or keeping whole clusters and just throwing whole clusters in there. What's some of your thinking about why you choose to do some stems back in?
Well, it is kind of a stylistic thing. It's definitely another buzzword.
Yeah.
A lot of people are doing 100% stem inclusion. I think sometimes that makes it taste like stems.
Yep.
But it kind of shows you what the stem is bringing. And at just a small amount, we're usually just 15%. I've started doing experiments where certain ones have higher amounts, with the idea that you can always blend them back together and mitigate that. But at small amounts, I think you're just changing the texture slightly, and you're bringing a little more complexity. These wines in both North and Southern Rhone are kind of known for their aromatic complexity, for their non-fruit flavors and savory notes. We talk about oil-cured olives, Syrah sometimes. We talk about garrigue. We talk about crushed rock. And those are the things that are interesting. I think just a little bit of stems helps with that, and helps. You don't want just berry flavors, I think, to make it more interesting.
Right, especially when I feel like in Washington, it's pretty easy to get fruit. It's easy to get fruity flavors. It's easy to get a lot of those primary, aspects of a big New World style wine, whereas it might be a little trickier to get those tertiary components, the herbals, the spices.
The fruit will take care of itself.
Yeah, exactly.
Everything we do is to kind of bring it into balance, the non-fruit flavors. So native yeast fermentation encourages that, all the way through stem inclusion and neutral oak aging in larger barrels.
Right. Well, and so talking about oak now, this is basically a neutral barrel and concrete, but you do use a little bit of new oak for a Rhone wine, right?
For the Syrahs.
For the Syrahs.
But we don't. Yeah, I think Grenache and new oak just is not something that we're trying to achieve here. I think some people can do it and it can be delicious. But I think here we've worked so hard to source these interesting vineyards, and finding great Grenache in Washington is not everywhere yet. So I'm really happy that we have this block, and I just want it's more about showing that.
Yeah, showing the grapes, showing the vineyard, less about flavoring it or affecting it.
Yeah, what the new barrel tends to do is darken the flavor, which with Cabernet is a great thing, right? And sometimes with Syrah it can be good, but I think just with Grenache, these kind of flavors just want to retain freshness.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, let's switch gears and taste a little bit of Arnaut so we can get into some Syrah.
Sounds great.
All right, so now we have our 2018 Arnaut Syrah. So this is a single vineyard Syrah, so 100% of the grapes are from Boucher Vineyard in Yakima Valley, and it's 100% Syrah. There's no other grapes in here. It's a very, very unique expression.
Yeah, this was the original Rhone wine I wanted to make when we first started in 2010, and so I called up Dick Boucher and said, hey, can you spare any Syrah? And he actually gave us a little bits of 3 of his best blocks. So it was really amazing that first year. Very generous of him. As we move forward, I kind of identified 2 specifically that I really like. So to this day, it's these same 2 blocks. They're not far from each other. The same thing, like we talked earlier about Syrah being a terroir grape. In Châteauneuf-du-Pape, the people will have whole vines in different parts of the appellation, and then they blend it together based on different grapes growing better in other places. But in Syrah, it's from one spot, right. And so I wanted to kind of do that and show. I mean, Boucher Syrah, it blends well with other areas, but why would you want to?
Right, it's so unique,
in my opinion, yeah, it's so unique. And these were his first 2 plantings he did, 94 and 96.
Wow. So and speaking more about the block, so the 94 block was the Grand Côte block, correct? And then the 96 is the Factory Road. And talk a little bit more about what makes those distinct and different, and sort of what characteristics from each you're looking at.
Yeah, they're less than a mile apart. The Grand Côte, it makes up usually about 60% of the blend. It's a south-facing slope, and it's south-facing and sloped, and it's at about 800 feet elevation. And it brings a lot of dark fruits. It brings a lot of meat and olives and kind of those classic dark-hued Syrah notes. The Factory Road is up a couple, 150 feet of elevation from there. As it goes towards the ridge of the hill there, and it's a really different expression. It's a little bit lighter fruit, a little more red fruit. It's still a big, powerful wine, and it has these notes of sometimes you get with Syrah is more like orange rind a little bit.
Like brighter elements.
Yeah, the brighter elements, and what I kind of think of as like iron notes too. It's really distinct to it every time. Again, we want to honor the fruit here, but we do use about 15% new oak, some of which is a 500 liter, what we call puncheon, which even though it's new, it's only hitting maybe 40% of the
right. Because basically, the larger the barrel, the less surface area to wine ratio. Than a bunch of smaller barrels, which touches more of the wine, which imparts more flavor.
Yeah, so we use a combination of those puncheons and then barriques, which is your standard barrel. And it ages slower, so we're trying to retain some of that freshness by aging some of it in larger vessels.
But I think what's interesting too, and you've talked to me about this before, is how specific this new barrel is, or these new barrels, and how you've basically chosen a cooperage in a specific forest with a specific toasting that really matches well or pairs well with this wine.
Exactly. It's a barrel that brings out these kind of mineral non-fruit elements. It's kind of a savory, smoky flavor, but not overdoing it on the smoke. Almost like soy, maybe more like soy. So really savory. And it's just from one forest, and we don't use that anywhere else in the winery. And so I think it brings this kind of it just has its own identification.
Yeah.
That way, you know.
This is just a powerhouse wine. Every year, I feel like Arnaut, it gets the attention it deserves. Really, like it's a benchmark Syrah wine for Washington. But oh man, 2018 is starting to blow me away with its quality. And so, talk a little bit. I know we just tasted the 2018 La Pearl, the 2018 Justine, but talk about the vintage in Washington in general, and sort of why you're excited about it, and how you thought it went.
Yeah, it'll be really fun to follow these wines. It was just one of those picture perfect harvests, and the wines just bore that out immediately, and they're now all in bottle. So it's exciting to start sharing them with you all. It was a classic hot Washington summer, but about the middle of August, it kind of just cooled down. Instead of being in the hundreds, it was in the upper 80s. You know, and that doesn't sound cool, but it's just as the grapes start turning color from green to red, they're more susceptible to sunburn. You kind of just want a little more moderation of the heat, and that doesn't always happen, but it did here. But it was still sunny and nice out there, but 85 degrees. And then about the second week of September, it went down another notch into the high 70s and low 50s, and just stayed sunny. And it's just like we got a lot of hang time. We can pick things at the optimal ripeness because they're not ripening so fast that they're hard to catch at that right moment.
And it still had some acidity.
And the weather, yeah, absolutely, yeah. And the color is just noticeably darker than most other vintages, and just the depth of flavor and structure, balance. It's just one of those special vintages. So all Washington vintages are pretty good. We're lucky here. We're lucky here. We have the dry weather all through summer, and then usually through most of harvest, it's fairly dry. And I think every year we're able to make very, very good wines. But it's fun that there is still vintage variation.
Well, and I think it's a good point too that I get a lot of questions about vintage variation. What vintages are the best? What vintages should I avoid? And it's really tricky because I think a lot of it depends on the winemaking decisions. It depends on the growers and how they crop their vineyards and how they treat their canopies. And I find that Washington is really good at still making great wines in bad vintages.
In challenging.
Challenging, because really all it is, there's going to be struggles, but as long as you are keenly aware of sorting and sort of getting out some of the problem bits of your harvest, about certain decisions you're making in the cellar as far as fermentation. And there's so many things you can do to still produce great wines in harder vintages that it's really a hard question to answer when someone's like, oh, what vintages? The other day I had someone asking about what vintages of Sestina should they drink. I'm like, all of them, just all of them. That there's something really unique and great about vintage variation. And at the end of the day, that's what wine's about too. It's and I know you've talked about this before too, how we don't want to make the same wine every year. We really want the wines to reflect both the place and the time that it was grown.
Yeah, the wine should have its own identity every year. You should say, oh, yeah, that's Arnaut, all right. But in 2018, it's very big and structured, and in something like 2013, it's kind of more light on its feet, more elegant, but no less enjoyable.
Yeah.
There can be just different styles of vintages.
Yeah. Well, it's great. Well, this has been really fun. Just sort of geeking out a little bit about Rhone varieties, about the Rhone region in France, sort of talking more about Washington and sort of the future of some of these grapes. These wines are just delicious. Super excited about getting these released to everyone in mid-September. So I just wanted to, basically thank all of you for joining us and just geeking out with us a little bit. We love talking about this stuff, and thanks again, Chris.
Yeah, until we can do it in person, we'll taste wines with you this way.
Exactly. Cheers.
Cheers.